The Second World War is associated with many tragic events, and not only those that are common knowledge, but also those that are lost in the general material of global catastrophes. Compared to the millions of lives lost, the deaths of a few thousand people seem insignificant, and yet these were the lives of people who hoped for something, believed in something, and did not lose hope to the last. Therefore, even such insignificant tragedies should not be forgotten. Such a tragedy was the loss of the ship Rigel on 27 November 1944. That day the cargo ship was heading south. It was already late autumn. The sea and the air were cold, and the ship sailed leisurely in its direction. The ship was built in 1924 in Copenhagen by order of the Bergen Steamship Company. The Rigel had 5 cargo holds. It was intended for casing South American lines, except that in November 1944, it was used for a completely different purpose. The Rigel was not carrying cargo or military equipment, although initially it had just such a mission. On the 27th of November, the ship was carrying people. Most of the passengers were prisoners of war. There were more than 2,000 of them. The bulk of them were prisoners of the Red Army. But there were also Poles, Yugoslavs. There were also German soldiers accompanying the prisoners on the ship. There were about 400 of them. There were even German deserters. But there were not so many of them compared to the total number of those being transported. Rigel became a floating prison for a while, although it was not specially equipped for this. No one began to change the functionality of the ship. In its structure, it remained a cargo ship, and the men were kept in the same holds as the cargoes. The conditions for prisoners of war were terrible. It was very cramped, there was no ventilation, and the sanitary and hygienic conditions were unimaginable. British pilots passing by spotted the ship. They immediately recognized it as a German troop transport. They were sure that it was carrying reinforcements for the German troops that were stationed in Central Europe. The convoy was poorly equipped, and what could it do against the aeroplanes? The British military hit the target with precision. The gangways in the cargo holds were destroyed. The ship began to sink. Everyone on board was doomed, but everyone fought to the last for their lives, and those who could not be saved died a horrible death. They fell into the icy water with the same icy air around them. To swim even a few meters in such water was a real feat. In addition, it was necessary to get out under incessant British fire. They shot at those who were in the water. They were also shelling the life rafts. Those who didn't drown in the sea were burned alive. Because of the shelling, not only the ship caught fire, but also those parts of it that were already in the water. In the general panic, people could not make out in which direction they should swim, where to find salvation, and some of them were caught by powerful explosions in the first seconds of the bombardment. Even enemy relations of different nations were forgotten for a while. Russians and Germans were rescued on the same rafts, and after the rescued went in different directions, carefully pretending that they did not see each other. So, the common catastrophe united the implacable enemies for a while. Some of the Rigel's passengers did manage to escape. They reached the island of Russia on the available rafts. No one lived on this island, but nevertheless, it was a rescue island. As a result of the Rigel shelling, more than 2,500 people were killed, and for the most part, they were Soviet prisoners of war. 267 passengers escaped. The lucky ones managed to save their lives thanks to the efforts of the ship's captain. Heinrich Rode, who was steering the Rigel, managed in the last moments to throw the sinking ship on the shoal near the island of Russia. Naturally, nobody fished the unfortunates out of the water. The bodies of the dead were still floating on the shore for a long time, and some were even fished out by fishermen. Many were buried under the water. They stayed in the wreck for a long time. For several more decades, the bow of the Rigel rose above the surface of the water near the island. The remains of the victims were recovered only at the end of the 60s. They were buried in a military cemetery on the nearby island of Hieta. Why did the British make such a fatal mistake? The fact is that the Rigel was used as a cargo ship in Norway before the Second World War broke out. But after the country was occupied by the Germans, in 1942, the Rigel was requisitioned for the needs of the German army. The ship was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. On 9th of April 1940, it was being loaded for a voyage to South America. The German soldiers didn't want to miss the chance. Naturally, they took control of the Rigel. The ship carried out transports near the coast of Norway. As a rule, it carried ammunition, as well as supplies for German soldiers. The Rigel was run by Norwegian sailors, but on that fateful day, the ship's crew was fully staffed by Germans. The fact is that shortly before the Norwegian sailors announced sabotage, German transports loaded on board were dumped in the cargo holds. True, it was not quite clear whether on purpose the vehicles were badly secured in the holds, or whether they were originally on deck, and then as if by accident the vehicles fell into the holds, breaking through the cargo hatches. In addition, the Rigel was grounded at night. The ship was not badly damaged. The ship was towed to Stavanger, and the navigator and the captain were taken to the Gestapo. However, they managed to escape, as they both gave true testimonies that did not contradict each other. Then the German command decided to man the ship with its own crew. Initially, the ship's crew consisted of 29 Germans, but in Tomerneset, the Rigel was manned by another 121 Germans and additionally 948 prisoners. During the shelling of the ship, the British pilots were sure that only German soldiers were on board. That is why the command made the decision to destroy the ship. Rigel was shelled in several runs, and this was the cause of huge losses. Almost 30 years had to spend Rigel in cold waters, with most of its crew and passengers buried with it. After evacuation, the ship was scrapped. The British certainly did not know that there were Russian prisoners of war on board. They were absolutely certain that the ship was carrying German troops and equipment. Northern Norway did not have a sufficient level of intelligence. Data was passed on by the Crook's Residency, which was linked to the British SIS. On 26 November, Crook's station in Renga transmitted a message about the Rigel convoy. At the same time, the British did not receive any information about the cargo being transported. During the anchorages, the prisoners did not go on deck, although the British military guessed about the presence of people on the Rigel. But they assumed that it was about 1,000 or 2,000 German soldiers who were retreating from Finland. After the defeat of the Rigel, the British at first even rejoiced that few enemy troops will now be able to reach the Western Front. The Rigel disaster was the worst mass casualty in Norway during the Second World War. Such a number of casualties had never before occurred in the territory. The total number of deaths on the ship was about 1/4 of the total Norwegian casualties on various fronts. Today there is little mention of the disaster, but it is still a significant milestone in the history of World War II. Due to lack of coordination and poor awareness, innocent people who had already suffered during their time in Nazi camps suffered. The days of the sunken prisoners of war ended tragically, but the memory of their exploits and heroism will remain forever in people's hearts.